This lecture will introduce the book of Lamentations, which is a lament over the fall of Jerusalem. Author of Lamentations is debated. The book itself is anonymous. It does not say who the author is, but Jewish tradition has ascribed it to the prophet Jeremiah. The Septuagint reads that it was Jeremiah who sat weeping in the first verse. Septuagint also places the book of Lamentations together with the book of Jeremiah after the apocryphal book of Baruch. Now, Jeremiah lived through the fall of Jerusalem, and he was a man of much emotion and compassion, so it would not be unreasonable to deduce that perhaps he was the author. Jeremiah wrote other lamentations according to 2 Chronicles 35:25. There it says Jeremiah composed laments for Josiah, and to this day all the male and female singers commemorate Josiah in the laments, and these became a tradition in Israel and are written in the laments. Now, the book of Lamentations are not the same as laments for Josiah. It's a lament for the destruction of Jerusalem, but the fact that Jeremiah wrote laments makes it a little more plausible to think that perhaps he wrote Lamentations. On the other hand, there's nothing in the Hebrew text of the book that connects the book to Jeremiah per se. And so my conclusion is Jeremiah's authorship is possible but not certain. If you ask me who wrote the book of Lamentations, I would say, well, it might well be Jeremiah, but it might well be somebody else. In any case, the date of Lamentations is shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, but it would have to be before 539. 586 is when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. 539 is when Cyrus comes and allows the Jews to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. It would presumably be closer to the event, when the emotions were still raw, that the book would have been written. The book itself consists of 5 acrostic poems, carefully constructed poems, unified by the common theme of lament over the destruction of Jerusalem. This will explain, by the way, the number of verses. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Each verse starts with a succeeding letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so there'll be 22 verses in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And when you get to chapter 3, they do it in triplicates. So they do 3 verses beginning with Aleph and 3 verses beginning with Bet, and so on through the Hebrew alphabet. And therefore there are 3 times 22 or 66 verses there, because it's following that acrostic pattern. All except the last one, I should say, are acrostics. Now, some have described the style of poetry in this book as Kina style. Kina is the word for lament in Hebrew. And at least in poems 1 through 4, they follow a pattern of longer line followed by shorter line. And insofar as one can try to reconstruct beats, and there are scholars like Longman that say that you just can't do that, but insofar as you try to do it, you'd end up with something like 3 beats, followed by 2 beats, followed by 3 beats, followed by 2 beats. And this is thought perhaps to be a dirge style. So, for example, in the first verse, you could try to feel the sense of it in the Hebrew if you read it this way. How deserted lies the city that was once so full of people. 3 beats. How like a widow she has become. 2 beats. It follows that kind of pattern throughout the book. Thus, rather than parallelism, there's intentionally unbalanced lines. And again, this is described as the Kina style or dirge style by some scholars. Structure of Lamentations is chiastic. Poem 1 talks about present anguish of Zion. Poem 2 talks about wrath because God has become their enemy. Poem 3, at the center of the chiasm, speaks of the compassion of God, and that's what's at the center of a chiasm tends to be the most important thing. Chapter 4 explains how the wrath came because of people's sin. You can see how that corresponds with B and B prime. And poem 5 is a prayer for the future hope of Zion. So, present anguish, future hope, A and A prime in the chiastic structuring. A little bit of the beginning of it. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. She's become like a widow who was once great among the nations. She was a princess among the provinces. She has become a forced laborer. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. She has none to comfort her. Among all her lovers, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile under affliction, and under harsh servitude she dwells among the nations. But she has found no rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of distress. The roads of Zion are in mourning because no one comes to the appointed feast. All her gates are desolate. Her priests are groaning. Her virgins are afflicted, and she herself is bitter. Her adversaries have become her masters. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord has caused her grief. Because of the multitude of her transgressions, her little ones have gone away as captives before the adversary. In chapter 1, you have personified Zion as the speaker at the end. Zion itself says, "Is it nothing to all you who pass this way? Look and see if there's any pain like my pain, which is severely dealt out to me, which the Lord afflicted on the day of his fierce anger." Chapter 2 points out that the Lord had become their enemy. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has destroyed its strongholds and multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and moaning. And what's the solution? Cry to the Lord. Their heart cried out to the Lord, "O wall of the daughter of Zion, let your tears run down like river day and night. Give yourself no relief. Let your eyes have no rest." Chapter 3 is the climax of the set of poems. And there's an interpretive question whether the man here is the author of Lamentations, Jeremiah, whoever, or is it the personified nation that speaks in this chapter? But it says some of the more positive things in the book about the compassion of God. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and the bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindness indeed never ceases. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. Chapter 3 calls on people to return to God. Let us examine and probe our ways, and let us return to the Lord. We lift up our hearts and hands towards God in heaven. There's also a prayer for relief from their suffering in verses 42 through 66. Again, in chapter 4, it reiterates the fact that the wrath has come because of sin, describes the siege of the city, and contains a curse on Edomites who joined in with the Babylonians in egging the Babylonians on. Verse 12 says, the kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the inhabitants of the world, that the adversary and the enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. Because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who have shed in her midst the blood of the righteous, they wandered blind in the street, and they were defiled with blood, so that no one could touch their garments. Again, it's because of the sins of her prophets, the iniquities of the priests, even the leaders, that brought on God's wrath. Chapter 5 gives a communal lament, would be the genre, which prays for the future of Zion. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to aliens. We have become orphans without a father. Our mothers are like widows. Skipping to verse 16, the crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. But then it has a prayer. You, O Lord, do rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are exceedingly angry with us. In the next video, we'll talk about the theological aspects of Lamentations.